Hi, my name is Julie Moore, and I'm the owner of the Bookworm Bookstore in Camarillo, California. And today we are traveling back in time to 1965, and we are interviewing the Hugo nominated finalist of the book Rediscovery, which is a collection of science fiction stories written by women. And then he's also come out with Kitra. Oh, there we go. And so this is a science fiction story where a 19-year-old girl decides to spend her life savings on a junkie ship and go out and see what's going on in the stars. So welcome, Gideon Marcus. Yay!
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. Lorelei, the person who illustrated it, is here too, actually.
Hello.
Hi.
She's shorter than me.
If you couldn't tell.
So I'm trying to find one of your illustrations. So what was your inspiration on this page?
Well, most of the the illustrations came directly from lines in the book. You'll see that it's got a caption on there. And so I think my dad went through and picked out some of his favorite lines at critical moments in the book and asked me to make illustrations for them, and I did.
That's very cool. So did you guys have discussions about the alien? The alien's named Pinky here, and he's described pretty well in the book, but did you have to kind of refine some things with your dad when you were putting it down on paper?
Yeah, absolutely. I started drawing him. He gave me some references from old D&D books and stuff with similar monster types.
Right.
But I started drawing him a lot more like liquidy and gloopy, sort of like a single cell organism, but like giant. And he's like, well, Pinky's actually more of like a rubber eraser texture, and so I had to incorporate that into like my shading and stuff to make him less of a gloopy alien, more of like a just sort of a suspension, like water suspension, like a large, almost kind of like eraser water balloon type texture. So that was definitely part of the process.
This is one of my favorite pictures because I want her hair. Wow, I want my hair to do that. That looks awesome.
Yeah, drawing Marta's hair was definitely some of the most fun I think I had drawing the pictures.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have a favorite illustration?
That's hard. I think the one I spent the most time on was the one where Kitra and Farid are walking through the cityscape. And I'm very proud of that one with the perspective and the detail. But I also quite like the one where the spaceship is flying around the gas giant. I did that one very quickly, and I like how it's both simple but very sort of a grand spectacle type of piece.
I was trying to find it. I've seen it. I just can't quite put my finger on it right here. But this is one of my favorite ones just because of the way that I guess I don't know what this is, like parts of the ship. Mm-hmm. They look like they're 3D dimensional. Like you could pick them up and do stuff with them. So I like that about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Was there anything you wanted to draw that didn't work out? Like, were there any parts that you wanted, after reading the book, that you wanted to illustrate, but it didn't make it into the book?
Well, when I was first reading the book had several iterations that I helped basically read and critique on and helped improve it when it was in the editing phase. And while it was in that process, I did several sketches and doodles for the book of just the characters and basically made fan art for it, which I think is part of why my dad considered me for the final illustrations, because I'd already started drawing for it. And there were some like cute doodles and stuff and concepts that never actually made it into the final version. There was also originally planning on having a lot more pictures for the book, but just for time constraints and also just the overall quality of the book, we wanted to keep it down to just 5 important moments. But I think we're talking about perhaps in the future, if I continue to do the art for the book, maybe putting together an art book surrounding like the process and all these extra illustrations that I've done, maybe someday in the far future.
That would be cool. Like, especially like a character, character study of each character from different angles and things like that. That would be
Yeah,
interesting.
absolutely.
So is this the cityscape you were talking about, or was there a
Yeah.
different one?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the one.
This is really, the shading on it really captures the fact that there's just nothing there. The desolation. I think the picture really helps with that.
Thank you.
So you have a question from Rita Schumann. Have you illustrated pictures for other books before?
I have not. This was my first professional job as a published illustrator, my debut. I have done a comic in the past where I sold that professionally when I was 11 or so, and definitely some cool stories there. I won't disturb the focus of the.
Oh, you can disturb you. She's more famous than I am, actually.
I went to
Comic
one year, and I did my comic Bluebird, which I think I have right over here, the original pilot that I did when I was quite young. But I showed this to Scott Snyder, who is the writer for Batman at DC Comics right now, and he actually based a character named Bluebird off of the comics that I gave him, and so that was definitely one of the coolest moments as an artist, and I think he's definitely influenced my life. Dustin Nguyen is another artist who he's like very kind and has given me a lot of advice, and I try to see him at conventions every year. So there's been a couple like artists in my life who've influenced me. I've definitely, I think, gotten to see like meet famous people on a personal level at a young age, which has been really cool. But in terms of professional work that I've done for books and stuff, this other than like comics that I've done personally, this is my first adding a work to a pre-existing work. But I'm definitely hoping to keep drawing for Kitra, and I'm hoping to do more professional work in the future. It's definitely a passion of mine, and so I'm very excited.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing with us.
Of course.
So that's a bonus that the book Bungalow yesterday didn't get. You actually got to interview the artist too.
Woohoo! Yeah, I'm imagining a graphic novel of Kitra.
That would be pretty cool. We're definitely going to make an audio book of it. Janice is actually quite an accomplished voice actress, and so she's going to do Kitra. And so, yeah, we're going to do all sorts of fun stuff.
Sounds great. So why did you choose to make your main character female?
Because I wrote what I wanted to see. So Kitra is the book that I have wanted to see in print for a long time. And the first rule of business, this is a free tip for all the entrepreneurs out there. If you want to make a successful business, think about all the things you wish existed and don't. And if you can do it, make it happen. So I grew up on space adventure books, the kind written by Robert Heinlein and Andre Norton, and what they were called juveniles back in the 50s and 60s. And they don't exist for the most part anymore. In the last 20 years, YA has gone dystopian and fantastic. And that's okay. I read The Hunger Games, I read Harry Potter, and I like it. It's fine. But I wanted this. And women protagonists are rare too. They're starting to exist in abundance, but not enough. So I wrote what I wanted to read.
Sounds good. I like how there's action in the story, but it's not constant action. Some of the ones like The Hunger Games, the ones that you're talking about, it's almost exhausting to read because they're just constantly in peril and something, there's something always going on. Here, there's a lot happening, but it's not a frantic pace, which I appreciated.
My wife once described good writing as the art of making small things matter. And so every scene that you write has to have some sort of conflict to be resolved. And it doesn't always have to be the end of the world. And in fact, it shouldn't be, because then all you can do is increase the scope and the stakes until it's the entire universe at stake. I'm not saying that the stakes won't get higher as the Kitra series goes on and make that dynamic. This is a realistic story. It's a hopeful story. And I did not plan for this story to come out in the midst of a pandemic and have these themes of isolation and teamwork and hope to overcome these things. But it's pretty timely.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're in space and the game. It's not so fun anymore. And that's how we feel at our house about Monopoly. It's like, it was great, you know, the first 2 hours. And after that, it's like, I don't know if we could do this anymore.
Right.
So are you, so you said that there's 10 books in the series that you have planned.
Correct.
Is it like, do each of the books stand alone? Does it kind of build on each other?
Yeah, I don't think anyone likes picking up half a book. So absolutely every single one of the books is going to be a complete, self-contained, satisfying story. But they're all going to make an arc. I've got plans for a 4-book arc and a 6-book arc. And they will all together make an even bigger arc.
Mm-hmm. So what's the first arc? Is it the four books or the 6 books that you have?
The four books.
Okay, so this is the first of the 4 mini arc.
That's right, and they're all plotted out. So if anyone wants to write fan fiction, go right ahead. Your ideas will not get incorporated in my books.
Okay, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think we all write fan fiction hoping that you'll take our great ideas and run with them.
Yeah, but you remember, there's a whole copyright can of worms you don't want to open up there. So.
So I hear that your house is not in the 20th century, or well, that's not the right way to say it. But I don't think that year 2020 is happening in your house. What year is it in your house?
So the thing that I've gotten a few Hugo nominations for is Galactic Journey, galacticjourney.org. It's a time machine to exactly 55 years ago, and it updates every other day, and we write articles from the past as if we're living there. And to aid the illusion, our house has become something of a time warp bubble. So for instance, I have a radio station that plays only the music of 55 years ago. In fact, with Jerry and the Pacemakers. And I even have a TV station. This is Channel 9. If you get within a few hundred feet of my house. This is
there you go.
The first woman ever to be chosen international old-time fiddling champion. Signed, Winifred Chase.
This is To Tell the Truth. It's an old game show that hasn't existed for 50 years. So these are constantly playing. I set them up and they're in motion and they're constantly updated, but I never know what's going to play at any given time. So I'll usually go to sleep listening to my radio station. Tonight is Burke's Law night. So after we're done here, Lorelai and I are going to go upstairs and watch Burke's Law, which is a show probably none of you have heard of, but it's amazing. And then tomorrow we're going to watch Danger Man, Password, and Rocky and Bullwinkle.
I remember Rocky and Bullwinkle. That's about it. Natasha and Boris are up to their old tricks, I assume. What's the book behind you? Is it a record or is it a book?
Oh yeah, these are records. So as the records come out, I've got a place in the house where all the current records go, and there's several hundred records there now, and these are ones that came out pretty recently.
Okay.
In fact, that Jerry and the Pacemakers, they just came out with a compilation album just the other day, and I listened to that while I put together my stamp collection, which is something I never thought I would say, but when you're stuck in isolation, putting stamps together is actually kind of fun.
But are they only stamps from 1965?
So my dad apparently left me a huge collection. I didn't even know this. I found a bag with hundreds, maybe thousands of stamps in them. And they just sat for decades. And he gave up the hobby in the early 70s. So for the most part, all the stamps are period, and I'll occasionally take pictures of them and put them. If you go to Galactic Journey, you'll see the little news feed on the side where I update it with current events. So occasionally I put stamps there too.
Okay. So tell us about your other book. Tell us about Rediscovery. What was the reason that you started this project, and how long did it take you?
So Rediscovery was the reason we put together a publishing house. A couple of years ago, I was thinking that the whole paradigm of publishing had changed. And I don't know how much Camarillo works with independent and small presses. Obviously, you must do it a fair bit because you carry our books, for which thank you. I'm glad they're doing well for you. But yeah, just a couple of years ago, I was thinking about the industry, and I'm like, it's just not that hard to found a publishing house. And I've got lots of experience running companies. In fact, I used to run the company that makes the software that we're doing this on, actually. So I thought, why don't I just make my own publishing company? And what'll be my flagship product? And that was obvious. So Galactic Journey for the last 5 years had been summarizing all the best science fiction with a spotlight on women authors. And there are very few anthologies of classic science fiction by women. There's like 3 or 4 that are currently available, and generally they're broad in scope and not terribly deep in content. And there's tons of names that just get skipped over. I go to conventions and most people know Ursula K. Le Guin or Anne McCaffrey, sometimes Andre Norton, but very few people know Roselle George Brown or Catherine McLean or Otis Kidwell Berger or Sonia Dorman, who didn't even write under her own name for much of her career. So I thought I'll put together my anthology of my favorite works. And that was actually really easy because all I had to do was go through all my articles, find the ones I liked the best, and put together 14 of them. A slightly harder project was finding a bunch of current creators who were women who were up-and-comers, so people who had done things. So, for instance, Marie Vibert has been published in fantasy and science fiction, and there's some other. Cora Bullard is now got a Hugo nomination for Best Fan Author. Claire. Claire just sold a TV show. So they're all people who are at the level of these authors at the time when I took these stories from. And I wanted to give these stories context. So the whole project, including transcription of the stories and packaging, getting the foreword, which was amazing. It was provided by the widow of the person who did the artwork. This is a very famous drawing from 1957. It was a few months of work. And it was mostly a learning experience because I'd never put a book together before. Kitra came together much more quickly as a result.
Now, what types of books does your publishing house publish? Is it only science fiction, or do you have a variety of titles?
So Rediscovery is going to be a series. There'll probably be 6 books in it total. Kitra, of course, is going to be 10 books. At the end of the year, Janice has a high fantasy gay romance coming out, which is amazing. And it's going to be one of those things where there's going to be an audience that's like, oh my God, this is what we were waiting for, because there aren't a lot of them. We're also doing reprints. So for instance, this book, Tom Purdom's I Want the Stars, came out in 1964. And I happen to know Tom, and I asked him, hey, this book hasn't been in print for 55 years and I really liked it. Would you like me to reprint it? And he said, sure, go for it. So we have a great new cover for it, which we'll show you in a second. And so that's going to come out. And I picked that one specifically because it's very timeless, like I hope Kitra is too, where it's not rooted in its time. But in terms of other things, I've got a friend who's a space historian, very prominent space historian. I'd love to publish some of his stuff. We've got some other reprints coming up. So I think our focus is going to be science fiction and fantasy, because that's what I like to read. Preferably from voices maybe we don't hear so much from. But yeah, we'll probably come out with 3 or 4 books a year.
Now, so you have your own publishing house. Did it make it easier or harder to get everything through the process? Since it's all the steps, is it?
Once you know what you're doing and you have the right people, the publishing is easy. The most challenging thing was coming up with a marketing plan. And the funny thing is we had a choice very early on. Do we go the Amazon online route like everybody else, or do we double down on bookstores? And we made that choice. And I've never regretted that choice. You meet great people bookstores are centers of literacy, and you go to them and it's a warm, fuzzy third place, and they've read the books and they can tell you what's worth reading in a way that you just can't get from a soulless online thing.
We appreciate that.
Well, you know, we've scratched each other's backs, right? So
Absolutely.
Rediscovery, right before the coronavirus hit, Rediscovery was in 330 bookstores, which is pretty good. So I don't know what's going to happen right now. Right now, we're transitioning to this virtual thing, but I suspect one way or another, all of us, bookstores and publishing houses, will survive. I have read that traditional publishing is by far the hardest hurt, because as a self-published, well, I won't say self-published, as an independent press, we have ISBNs, we have staff, so we're a real publishing company. We are flexible, just like the independent small bookstore is flexible, whereas
Right.
the big box places and whatever are not. So I think Amazon will survive, but I don't think they'll be very responsive to what people want. I don't think Barnes and Nobles is going to make it, and I don't think the big five are going to. They're already laying off people, so I think we're ultimately going to be fine in a few months.
I hope so.
You said
That sounds
hopefully.
good to me. Yeah, that sounds
So
good.
everybody buy lots of books.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm Julie.
Go out and buy this book or this book, or you could pre-order 1 through 10 and I'll get them to you when they are out.
And I have, at some point before this show is over, I actually have a list of other books that are great books from the early 60s, all of which you can get from the Bookworm, and you should. So I will tell you all about those. But first, there's a whole bunch of questions. Do you mind if I answer some of these questions?
No, go ahead. I can't see them for some reason.
If you click on chat, you will see all the questions. So there's actually been a chat roll going this whole time. Although if this video ever makes it to YouTube, they'll go, chat roll? What chat roll? You have to actually be logged in through here. So Jimmy has a whole bunch of questions. So let's see what I can do. He wants to know where I got the names. So all of those names are Turkish. They're all Turkish. Most of them are actual Turkish place names. So it's that whole, just like America is filled with New England and New York and New Amsterdam and Bismarck, North Dakota. There's lots of places that have origins across the sea. Her particular planet, Vatan, is a Turkish colonized planet. But the culture of the empire is largely French. I wanted to create sort of this Levantine feel to it, so the whole Turkish-French sort of feel to it. Given Kitra's romantic interest, how well accepted do you expect it to be in various school systems? So that's an interesting question, right? Kitra is queer. Kitra is bisexual. I never say in the book Kitra is bisexual, but her ex-girlfriend is on the ship. And by the way, that moment that happens early on in hyperspace, I think you know which moment I'm talking about, between Kitra and Marta, which sort of overshadows the rest of the book. I didn't plan that. The characters just wrote themselves into that. And it makes perfect sense. So I must have done a decent job with realizing these characters. So it has not one character, but at least two queer characters. But there's also a suggestion of a romantic interest between her and Farid. And we certainly know that Marta was going out with Kitra, and now she's going out with Peter. I don't really care which schools mind. I suspect it's not going to be a big deal. For one thing, it's a G-rated book. So the fact that two people are going out, I don't think is that scandalous in 2020. I should hope not. Certainly in 1965, this would absolutely be banned, and I'd probably be arrested for peddling smut, which is an interesting idea. But it's a pretty innocent book these days. And she had, she wanted to, so in the book I talk about Magellan, Armstrong, and Ansari, and Jimmy wants to know who Ansari was. The implication that Ansari is an explorer who we've never heard of. And so the answer to that is you'll have to wait and see.
So books 2 through 10, it'll be there somewhere. You'll explain it at some point.
Maybe, maybe not. You know, the art of writing. I read a great Robert Silverberg story today in June 1965 Galaxy. You don't have to tell everything. And that's part of what makes the universe even bigger, is when you don't info dump everything about the universe, you simply bring in elements as the characters see them, and it makes for a much bigger universe.
So what's your process? Do you plot everything out before you start writing? Do you kind of let the story lead you? What's your process?
I generally make an outline of the big bullet points I want to get to. But then I'll know that the scene is coming up. I'll often write much of it in my head and then get in front of the computer and dump it. And I always have to write 1,000 words a day when I'm working. But sometimes I write myself into corners. You're going to get to a part in the book pretty soon where Kitra apparently cannot solve the problem, and they're screwed. And when I wrote that, I had no idea how she was going to get out of it. And I'm like, well, I have a problem. And as a writer, you have two choices, right? You go back and you write yourself out of the corner backwards, which is cheating. Or you ask the characters, well, what would you do if you were in the situation? And the solution that they came up with, which is one that requires everyone in the crew, which is why I love it, is utterly consistent. And when you read it, you'll think, oh, of course, he set this up from the beginning. He's got these breadcrumbs all along. But I didn't. I actually just wrote the book, and the characters figured out their way out of the problem.
Interesting. So do they talk in dialogue to you, or do you kind of interpret what they're saying? I don't know. When you're saying that the characters did it themselves.
Running it since I was 8. And writing a book is kind of like being a dungeon master for an audience of 1 or perhaps 1,000,000. You're creating the story and you've got the characters in the story. And as a DM, your job is to keep the universe interesting around the characters, to keep the players engaged. So these characters in the book are essentially characters from a role-playing game. I mean, they aren't, but it's like that. And so as a DM, I'm like, okay, here's the situation. Here's the challenge I've given them. What are ways they can get out of it?
So it's almost like choose your own adventure, but your characters are making the choices for your book.
Right, right.
Okay. All right. Are there other questions? I'm not sure.
Yeah, Jimmy thanks me for keeping the science accurate, where I talk about things like degrees Kelvin. I really try to keep the science invisible in Kitra, because obviously if you're 14-year-old reading it, you may not know all the concepts. But at the same time, I don't want to talk down to my readers. My science fiction stories are going to be science fiction. They're not going to be science fantasy like, say, Star Wars. And so I work very hard to make the science consistent, so that way people reading them not only enjoy the heck out of themselves, but they also maybe learn something and certainly don't get any false ideas about how the universe works. So while the books may have things like hyperdrive and anti-gravity, which don't exist now, and they just have to obey consistent laws. For instance, I had to be extremely detailed talking about things like pressure, which you'll get to in a couple of chapters based on where you are. So science is very important to me. My first major was astrophysics, and I've been a teacher by profession, amateur and professionally, and it's just important that whatever you read in the book is accurate.
Great. Did you want to give us your list of suggestions?
Sure. So as the journey has gone along, in fact, the journey started because in 1958 or 2013, depending on your perspective, Janice said, "You're reading all these magazines. Why don't you tell me which stories you like?" Because I started doing the day-by-day thing just privately for fun in 1954. Interestingly, that was the year that they first said that science fiction is dying. So in the process of doing the blog, I found a whole bunch of books that were really good. And unfortunately, a lot of them aren't in print. So for instance, Zena Henderson wrote some of my very favorite stories. She's one of the best authors of the Silver Age of science fiction. And these books are not in print. I may have to fix that. This book, which is the first woman's intergalactic space cop book, will be in print next year because we're going to do it. And of course, we're doing I Want the Stars. But
So
books,
she's a cop?
yeah. She is Sybil Sue Blue. But books that you can get and should get from Julie are, first off, since we're talking pandemics, so this is Sign of the Labrys by Margaret St. Clair. It came out a couple of years ago from my perspective, 57 years ago for everybody else. And if you play Dungeons and Dragons, if you've ever seen the original rule books, at the end of the rule books, you'll see that there's a bibliography of books that inspired Gygax and Arneson to make their game. And this was one of them. So it's set, a pandemic hits the earth. It kills a lot of people, but more, it just sort of saps our will to really care. We lose our zest for life, and everyone's sort of zombie-like going through their motions. And one guy ends up invited into this vast underground bunker complex that was built in case of atomic catastrophe. And as he goes down these levels, like D&D levels, he finds more and more weird things until he gets to the bottom, and all sorts of weird philosophical, religious stuff. The book gets weird in the second half, but it's a good book. Sign of the Labrys, and it's available from the Bookworm. Another book that ended up in D&D is Poul Anderson's really fun 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. A Dane ends up in this fantasy, a Dane from our world ends up in this fantasy world, and there's trolls and swan mays and gnomes, and they were taken whole cloth into D&D from this book. Speaking of apocalypses, this is Daniel Galouye. He was a science fiction author from New Orleans, also a journalist. And so Dark Universe is also an after the bomb in the bunker story, except it's 100 years after the bomb, and humans have not seen light for decades. So everyone grows up blind, and we've coped with it either with better hearing, or some of us have developed infravision. But the neat thing about Dark Universe is when these people see light, it's not a good thing. It's a scary, unknown, crippling thing. And so it's sort of an analysis of what disability is. And when you are I won't say overcome, when you are living your life with your disability, and it is part and parcel of who you are, including your coping with it, isn't an advantage to suddenly lose that disability. And this book, in many ways, says not necessarily. It's really interesting. And then, of course, we have the classic A Wrinkle in Time, which we read as a bedtime story to Lorelei, a chapter at a time, when it came out. A couple of other books you can get from Julie that I don't happen to have copies of are The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard. It's important that we had a book by J.G. Ballard because he and Brian Aldiss were sort of the vanguard of what's called the new age of science fiction, which is just starting to happen in 1964-65, where science fiction stops being nuts and bolts and hard stuff and tech solutions, and more about the psychological meaning of being human. And that no one does, that the world is ending, but let's take time for tea like the British do. And J.G. Ballard is definitely in that school. And I had one other book. Help me out. What was the other book I recommended for you?
I'd have to look it up. I can't remember.
I know you've got it.
Graybeard?
No, Graybeard was one of the ones I recommended, but it's not in print. Yeah, this is Graybeard by Brian Aldiss, but it's not in print right now. Neither is Arthur C. Clarke's A Fall of Moon Dust, which is a real shame. A lunar tour bus has an accident. It's as crunchy as it gets. But it's in your email somewhere what
Yeah,
the
I'll have to look for it.
was. You know what? Just ask Julie. Julie will tell you what to buy. So after this show, we have a link. In fact, it's up right now. Just go to the Camarillo Bookworms site on Facebook and just send Julie a message saying, "Hey, I want this, 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 and what else can you recommend?" And she will give you 20 books that will make you happy. Because all you have to do is go to Galactic Journey and look up our Galactic Stars entries, and we go through the best science fiction of every year as it comes out.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a really exhaustive list, which is great because sometimes people will say, I read this and this, what do I do next? And I wasn't quite sure where to steer them. So I like that we have a lot more, it broadens our world so we can like you said, kind of delve into the roots a little bit more. Because a lot of the books now, they seem sci-fi, but then they kind of veer off into other things. So it's nice that you like pure sci-fi.
There's very few people writing hard science fiction, particularly accessible to younger people. That's my goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think they're the people maybe most excited about space travel, and, you know, maybe in their lifetime they can, I don't know, colonize Mars or something. Who knows?
That would be cool.
Yeah. But you have to have all the right atmospheric pressures and all of that going on.
So if the audience has any more questions, this is the time for you to line them up, since we are approaching the end of the program, I think.
Yeah, we're winding I said we're winding down. Yeah, you're right.
But what do you have any more questions for me about living in the past, or books I'm writing, or fun working with bookstores?
Yeah, I mean, is there like you were talking about the space show? I mean, is there this whole like, can people hire you for parties and stuff? Are you the space guy that does parties, or what's your like sideline with that?
So yeah, before coronavirus hit, I was actually a pretty popular guest. I made regular appearances at the local space-themed microbrewery, and those are always sold out. I mean, I didn't charge, but I mean, the room was filled to fire marshal capacity. I really miss those. We're getting creative. So I used to do shows for the Reuben H. Fleet Space Theater in San Diego, which is sort of our big science museum here. And it got canceled because of coronavirus, but not too long ago, the person who runs the shows asked if I would do a virtual show. So who knows? We might even reach more audience as a result. So we are adapting to the situation.
Sounds good. I'm glad that we have stuff to look forward to from you.
Absolutely. In fact, we've got a bi-weekly show called The Journey Show, which is basically Galactic Journey, the TV show. It's for anyone who knows, it's sort of a combination of Jack Benny and That Was the Week That Was. And we have musical guests, and I tell the news, sometimes humorously, and then we have other guests. This weekend we're doing an arts and entertainment edition with some real powerhouse guests. So that'll be fun.
Excellent. All right. Are there any more questions we need desperately to answer? Or should we sign off?
I think we've worked out our customers. The nice thing about this is the people who came, thank you all for coming. There'll probably be a lot more people who see this show, because we recorded this in front of a live studio audience so that we could then replay it ad nauseum, and other people can enjoy it, because this is an odd time, right? It's right after work on the Pacific Coast. That said, this is the start of a series for the Bookworm. And Julie's going to be interviewing lots of authors, most of them cooler than I am. So, so that's something to look forward to.
Yeah, we're hoping to do it once a month, and we'll have to figure out, we'll have to play with the times a little bit and see what works for our audience, our viewers, or whatever we're calling the people that are watching this show. But yeah, I'm excited that Gideon brought up the idea to me, and I love connecting with, you know, authors that are publishing now. And like he said, you know, you're giving us authors to read from the past, so it's exciting.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate you inviting me on here, and maybe we can do it again sometime. We've got more books coming out.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for coming.
All right, thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Come see me at the Bookworm.
Yes, see you at the Bookworm. Camarillo Bookworm.
Camarillo.
Camarillo.
Yes.
Carillo.
The LL is a Y sound. It's Spanish.
I do know that. But my dad was from San Pedro, despite the fact that it's spelled San Pedro. So, all right, Camarillo Bookworm. Check it out.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.